Alright, so we are giving problem 387 on LeetCode, and it says that given a string s, we have to find its first non-repeating character, and we have to return its index, right? And if it does not exist, all we're going to do is return -1. And if you don't quite understand what I mean by this, we have an example here. 3 examples actually. So for our first example, our input is a string that says LeetCode. So we have to iterate through every letter in the string, and we have to find the first letter that repeats only once, right? So the first letter is L, and it does not repeat anywhere else in the string, so we already found it. And we just return the index, which is going to be 0 since it is in the 0th index. In our second example, a little bit more complicated, we have love LeetCode. So the first letter repeats, because it repeats here, and it repeats here too. So that one doesn't work. We go on to the next letter, O. That one doesn't work either because it repeats both here and it repeats over here as well, right? We move on to the third letter, and we see V only repeats once, right? So that is exactly what we need, and we're going to return its index, which in this case is going to be 2 because the V is in 0, 1, 2, and the second index, correct? And for the last example, we have an example of a string that we would have to return -1 for, because it does not have a character that repeats only once. You see, A repeats twice, and B repeats twice. So in this case, we just return -1. Our constraints are going to be that the length of the string has to be between 1 and 105, and it has to consist of lowercase English letters. I've created a basic function here, which is the function that you were given by LeetCode, which is going to be called first unique char, and it's going to have a parameter of s, which is going to be our string, and that is why it is of type string. And our return value right now is none, but we're going to work on this. So first of all is thought processes, and that is, how can I solve this issue, or what would be the best approach to solving this issue? So the first thing that came to mind for me was this idea that for each letter, we're going to have to keep track of how many times this letter occurs throughout the entire string, right? So that already hinted at the fact that I needed a key and a value, right? So this red lights, and it's telling me I need a hash map. And if we remember, a hash map or a dictionary is gonna be composed of a key and a value, where our key is going to be our letter. So for example, in the example LeetCode, we're gonna comment this, and we're gonna make the example LeetCode. In the example LeetCode, for example, once I'm iterating through the string, I see L, and I'm gonna say, okay, this has occurred once, right? And then we move on to the next letter, right? So it's gonna say, okay, I see E. E has occurred here 3 times within the string. So this is what our dictionary is going to look like. But we're going to be the ones that have to update whether it encounters a new letter, and whether we have to update how many times this letter has been seen within this string, right? So in our function, first we have to create our dictionary, right? So I'm going to call it unique dictionary, just udic for short. And I'm going to set this equal to an empty dictionary. And then I'm going to go ahead and create my solution variable, which is just going to be equal to an empty string. And this solution will not give me the index, it'll just give me the letter that we're looking for, right? So now we have to iterate over the string, correct? So we can say for letter inside of our string, correct? If this letter already exists inside of our dictionary, then we just have to update its value, right? So for example, maybe it sees the letter E in LeetCode, but the E occurs 3 times. So every single time it encounters an E, it's going to have to update the value. What does that mean? That the value has to increase by 1, right? So then we can just say whatever letter it encounters, if it already exists inside of the dictionary, all we have to do is update this value by 1. Else, which means if it didn't encounter a letter that's already part of the dictionary, what does it do? Well, it has to add it inside of the dictionary, right? So then we can just say udic letter. So the letter that we're going to add into it is just going to be equal to 1, right? Because we're saying we've already found it, but just once. And if it finds it again, it's just going to update it by increasing it by 1. All right. So this for loop, to kind of reiterate, it's going to go through every single letter inside of a string. It's going to add it to the dictionary. If it already exists, it's just going to increase its value by 1. So it's going to keep track of how many times it occurs within the string. And if it encounters a letter that it's not part of the dictionary, it'll add it. Okay? So now what we want to do is we want to iterate over our dictionary and find an instance where the value is 1 and find its first instance of that case, right? Because remember, we are looking for the first non-repeating character, right? So we got to find that within the dictionary. So we're going to say for the letter I in udict, and I'm going to explain what this does. The items. Okay. So this for loop is going to get the items inside of the dictionary, and you might not be familiar with this terminology where you have letter and I. This just tells us I want to be using the key and the value at the same time. I want it to retrieve both key and value. So the letter is our key, right? Oh, and I have messed that up. Our letters are key, and the I is just going to be the value, which is how many times that letter has appeared inside of the string, right? And the way we can use this right here is by using the items in the dictionary. So now we're saying if that if our I, which is how many times a letter has occurred, is equal to 1, then we found it. We found a time where a letter has only occurred once in the string. So now, remember, we have our solution here. We want to set it equal to this. So our solution is going to be equal to that letter. And this is why we want both the key and the value, right? Because we want to make sure that we find where the value is equal to 1, that letter has only occurred once. And then we want to set the actual value, the actual letter, equal to our solution, right? So then we've already found it. We don't want it to continue running. If it continues running, it might find another instance where a letter has occurred once, but might not be the first letter that has occurred once, right? So we want to get out of here. So we're going to use the break statement, and what this does, it gets out of the loop, and it's going to continue running the rest of the program, right? And now all we want to do is find the index, right? Because it tells us to return its index. Right now we found the letter, right? But now we need to find the index. So we can just say that if our solution is not equal to an empty string, right? So we're saying if our solution exists, if it did not stay the way we started, that means it found it. So we're basically saying if you found a letter, then we're going to iterate through it, and we're going to iterate through our string, our initial string, and then we can just do if the index of that of our initial string, whatever we were given, LeetCode, love LeetCode, AABB, is equal to our solution. So if it finds the value of that index is equal to our solution, then great. We're just going to return the index, right? Else, we don't actually need it. We can create an else statement, but we actually don't need it, and I'll explain why in a little bit. But well, I can explain right now. So if this does not run, that means if our solution is not found, or like if it doesn't see that it already has a letter inside of the solution, the string is simply empty, our solution string is empty, it won't even run this, right? It'll go straight to returning -1 because it didn't find it, right? So that would be in the case that there is an input where every single letter repeats at least twice, and we are told that if it does not exist, we return -1. That's what we're doing at the very end, right? So if it does not find a letter that only repeats once, which is what this if statement does, it'll just do return -1. However, if it does find it, it'll run this, and once it returns the index, it will stop. The program stops. It does not continue on to this, right? So there's no reason that we have to use an else statement, because either way, it's only going to do one of two things. Correct? And here, remember, over here, we used the actual value. That's what we used for letter in S. When you use the for loop, just saying for n, it'll give you the value, but here we are saying for, and we're using the index because we're using in range. So you have to remember that over here we're using the value, and over here we're using the index, right? You don't want to get confused with that. And that is why when we are calling, we're looking for the letter within each index, we're saying the string and then the index to get the value. Over here, we're getting the value straight up. We don't have to call the index, right? But here we need it because, of course, our solution has to be the index. We're returning the index. And so this should work. So now we can just run our program. So we can say first unique char, and we're gonna test it with return values. It might not work. We might have to change it to print values, but we'll see that in a second. And then we'll just give it the parameter is going to be our sample that we had over here, so we can see if we get the same thing that they got, right? So now we can just run the code, which should be right here. And we see it doesn't return anything. And that is because when you're using LeetCode, the value that you return is going to console.log by itself. But over here, when you return it, it'll just return it directly into console. We're not printing anything out. So here we're going to do print instead of return. If you're doing it on LeetCode, you do not do this. Well, you don't have to. You just have to return the value. So we just go ahead and print it. And we're going to add a return value here. We're just going to do return 0. And we're doing this just so that both of these prints don't run, because like I said, the if loop only stopped completely because of the return statement, but if we give it a print statement, it'll continue on to the -1, so it'll always print the -1, and we don't want that. So now we can run it, and my run is over here. I have a bit of a weird run. See, okay, and this time we actually get the right solution, so we are getting 0. That is great, because over here our output is 0. We can test it out with the other test inputs. So love to LeetCode. And we can run this over here as well. Output is 2. Beautiful. That's exactly what we wanted over here. Love to LeetCode. Our output is 2. And lastly, we should get -1 for the last one because it does not have any unique characters, which is AABB. I'm just going to go ahead and type that in by myself. We're going to save that, and we are going to run it. And we get -1. So now let me lower this terminal. Okay, so the code works. You want to make sure that you are understanding why we are using a dictionary and how I came to that conclusion right away, because when you are doing these LeetCode problems, you want to find kind of like an idea of what you want to use right away, because the dictionary is not going to work for every single LeetCode problem, and you already know this. There's some other LeetCode problems that might be more based on you using maybe just a simple list, or perhaps they're not going to want you to use a hash map, but instead you're going to just want to use if-else statements. There's some LeetCode problems that have a bunch of edge cases. So right away, in the case of these problems, I was able to kind of figure out that we would have a key value pair, and that, shines the light. You're going to have to use a dictionary or a hash map. So just make sure you understand how the code works, why the code works, why we're doing every single one of these. And obviously, there is potential for improvement. Maybe you can bring this down to even fewer lines of code. It is possible you can do it. So really, you just want to make sure that you are understanding everything that is going on with each LeetCode problem, so that in the future, if you get a problem that might be not the same but similar, where you have to keep track of a key value pair, you're already going to have experience with it. And while it might mean that you have to change some of this code in between, you're already going to have an idea of how to do it. So good luck on future LeetCode problems.